Thank you, Janet, for that glowing introduction. I think I'm turning red, but maybe it'll bring out the red in my purple shirt here. It's, as I said, a great privilege to be back here at Unity Church in Vancouver. And I want to outline today the essence of what I've really 20 years of work in looking to how do we bridge the religions of the world. So I'm going to begin first by simply saying that everything I'm saying here today is nothing new. It was said in the Rig Veda long ago, truth is one. Sages call it by different names. And I think this is probably the principle that's central to the Unity Church as well. And what is that truth? There's a great Swami in Rishikesh who died, I think, around 1980. And his last words, he was on the path of truth, the kind of the yoga of Jnana, knowledge, the path of divine knowledge. And his disciples were closely gathered around him. And as he was passing away, these great truth seekers who had really given their lives to studying with him and working with him as their guru. And as the last words he spoke were these: love is the truth. And then he passed away. So the path of love and the path of truth actually converge into one at the highest reaches of the spiritual journey. And I'm often asked, how did you, because we have, well, let me go on here. I'll get to what I was about to say. So the corollary of that love is the truth, of course, is that hatred never ceases by hatred, but by love alone. This is an ancient and universal law. This is the great teaching from the Buddha. And as an application of that, the work that we do, that Cynthia and I do in our nonprofit institute, is really based on this principle of doing our bit to try to heal some of the divisions in the human family, some of these ruinous, devastating divisions. And so we have two projects, Gender Equity and Reconciliation International, and we will be doing this workshop this afternoon, giving a presentation and an experiential workshop around that work. And then the other one called The Dawn of Interspirituality, which is really to bring the religions together, not merely as comparative theology exercise, but really to bring them together in a unified spiritual quest of love. I'm often asked, how did you, because as Janet said, I began in physics and science, how did you move from being a quantum physicist to this gender reconciliation and then to this whole business of interspirituality? And for me, it's really very simple, because I always understood that science is a quest for truth. And the deepest truth is love. And the greatest form of love is divine love. So for me, it's been a very natural trajectory. And I want to speak now to this project, this work of belonging to God and dawn of interspirituality, a vision of how the religions come together at their root in love. And if we look across the scriptures and the mystics of the traditions, and I'm going to go through this very briefly. It's in much more detail in this book for those of you who are interested. It's, as I said, it's nothing new. It's sort of partly in the lineage of perennial philosophy, but this particular way that I articulate it is more focused on seeing love as the essential integral unit across the spiritual traditions of the world. Now, if we read the scriptures, what we find is that oneness with God is proclaimed universally across the traditions. For example, in the Upanishads, we have this wonderful statement, the four Mahavakyas, I am Brahman. Basically, the mystics have discovered this identity of the depths of the human being with the spiritual nature of the universe, or the origins of the universe, Brahman. We find it, again, of course, in Christianity, beautifully proclaimed by Jesus, I and the Father are one. We find it with the great Sufi saint, Al-Hallaj, who proclaimed, I am the supreme reality. And for that, he was basically given the same treatment as Jesus. He was publicly executed in Baghdad because those around him could only see this as blasphemy, because they had not yet discovered that living divinity within their own being. And again, from Judaism, we have this wonderful line from the Psalms, be still and know that I am God. So we see this oneness with God of the human being and the deity across the traditions. Now, the other quality that we see is this process of surrender. This very, God calls us to give ourselves back to God. And here we have some different expressions of it in the Bhagavad Gita: bow down and take refuge in God alone. This is the highest secret that is given at the end of the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, not my will, but thine be done in the Gospels. Essentially the same statement from the Quran and Deuteronomy. And even in Buddhism, where the whole path is not seen as theistic, but the actual practice is to relinquish your desires, because desire is the cause of suffering, and to basically follow the path of the Dharma. So it's a larger, higher wisdom that we follow in Buddhism. Now here, when we use this word surrender, I think it's important to understand that this is not some act of humiliating defeat, which it often is portrayed as. And even in our language, the word surrender doesn't carry, it's not a juicy thing to do. Hey, I think I'll go out and surrender today. It's like, I don't know, man, I don't think so. But we really need to understand that this is an act of joyous self-giving from the very depths of our being to that which is ultimate. And in that process, there's a whole purification that takes place. And in fact, what we find across the traditions is that the transformative journey of the soul bears a close resemblance, despite these very different theologies and different liturgies and different spiritual practices across the traditions. There is, in those people who practice deeply within the great spiritual traditions of the world, an intensity and humility that comes in the practice of genuine prayer and meditation, an utter self-giving, a self-giving to life, whether it's done through service, through love, through the bodhisattva vow in Buddhism, a process of purification and facing one's own darkness, a disciplining of one's desires, and a cultivation of ever more subtle levels of awareness. These are consistent across all the traditions. Practices that elevate and transform our consciousness, and then we move through stages of spiritual process and realization. And so the spiritual journey, phenomenologically, is actually very similar across the great spiritual traditions. And then if we look at some of the greatest mystics, here we have Shankara from Hinduism, Meister Eckhart from Christianity, Ibn Arabi from Sufism, Islamic Sufism, and they all speak of these three qualities of the highest realization: an experience of the highest being or highest truth, and then an awareness of that truth that is an awakening of wisdom, and then a total unspeakable ecstasy or bliss or sweetness that comes from this realization of the highest truth. So phenomenologically, we find these close parallels, and these are developed much more fully in the book. The great mystic Ramana Maharshi, Hindu mystic, who is usually seen as sort of one of the great icons of the spiritual path of meditation, but he speaks about the essence of devotion very beautifully. And he says this: perfect self-surrender leaves a residuum of God in which the I is lost. Jesus says the same thing. If you want to save your life, those who want to save their life shall lose it, but those who will lose their life for my sake shall save it. This idea that we surrender our very identity in some way. And then what happens is this: the I casts off the illusion of I, yet remains as I. Such is the paradox of self-realization. And the realized do not see a contradiction here. And that I that takes up residence in the place of our smaller, limited I is one with the divine being. So now, how do we understand these universals? We see this across the scriptures and the mystics. There is essentially this oneness of the mystics across religions. They're having this similar experience, and they're all proclaiming a kind of identity with the Absolute. How can we understand this? Particularly, how can a finite human being be one with the infinite Godhead? That is so preposterous at the mental level, which is why it was proclaimed as blasphemy. So what I have done in my own quest, because I was trained as a scientist, and the scientific worldview often is seen as sort of precluding the spiritual worldview. So I've spent years trying to grapple with how these two might come together. And that's what I want to share with you today. And I draw on various factors here. One is the work of David Bohm. Some of you may know the physicist David Bohm, who I had the privilege of meeting 35 years ago. And he basically speaks about the entire cosmos as a single unbroken wholeness or oneness in flowing movement. And he called it holo movement, meaning that it has a holographic quality, and we'll come to that in a moment. And then working with Einstein's relativity theory and fractal geometry and mathematics. And please understand, you don't need to have any scientific background to understand what I'm going to show you here. Just an eye for beauty is all that you need. So, but there is a key insight that's come from modern physics, and that is that reality has this fractal or holographic structure. And I want to just show you what that means. Some of you have seen the talk I gave before. May have seen this before. But the simplest example of this fractal structure comes from that little formula at the bottom. And if we plot the graph of that formula, we get this structure that looks like this. Sometimes you see it rotated 90 degrees the other way, but I like to present it this way because it looks a little bit like a sitting Buddha in meditation. And this is simply a mathematical object. It's the plot of a graph. You know, like when you, in high school algebra, you have y equals x squared, you plot it out and you get a nice little parabola. Well, here's another little formula. You plot it out and you get this. But this has a very remarkable structure. So if we zoom in at the top here and we kind of blow it up, we find this. Can you all see this well enough? I don't know. Those lights can be dimmed a bit, maybe not, but I think you can. Can you make it out? Yeah. Okay. So, and if we basically keep zooming in up there, and we're kind of coming in by a factor of 10 each time, and we blow it up, we get this. And then if you see that little oblong in the center right here, if we magnify that, we find this. And then you can just see a little cross right there. If we blow that up, we find this. Now, at this point, we're about 10 million times magnified. So we're really taking a deep dive into this thing. And if you see a little star at the center there, we blow that up and we find this. And then that little black dot at the center, we blow that up and look what we find. 136 million times magnified, and we find this exact replica of the original. Now, this is a modern scientific discovery of an ancient principle known as the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. That the microcosm replicates the macrocosm, and that there is this correspondence between the structures of the highest divinities and the structures of our consciousness. Now, these fractals are abound in the physical universe, so I just want to show you how these principles get applied in our everyday world. Here's a fern where you can see that one leaf of this fern is like a miniature version of the whole thing. And this we see throughout nature. We see patterns like this. This is Romanesque broccoli, if you know that. And each one of these little nodules is like a miniature replica of the whole thing. So they're called, sometimes this is called self-similar structures or scale invariants. Same thing with tree branches. They have a fractal structure. If you take just this branch all by itself, it's like another trunk with its own branches. So you see this self-similar pattern throughout nature. Lightning has a fractal structure. This is the, actually, at the top here is the pupil of the eye. You can't quite see it, but these are the blood vessels in the human eyeball, which have this fractal structure. And actually, fractals are used to create incredibly realistic kinds of images in this way. So if you take this triangle here and you do a simple transformation from this into that by creating that simple transformation, and now you just replicate on the computer. You can write this in a few lines of code, and on the computer you do the same transformation on each of those four and you get this. And then you do the same transformation on each of these and you get this. And very quickly, just repeating that cycle, this whole thing generates landscape images like this. This is not a photograph. This is simply a computer-generated fractal structure with one rule for the mountains, one for the clouds, and one for the lake. And so what has been discovered is that this process of fractals are intimately associated with the very nature of creation itself. Here's another example, the spiral from the Mandelbrot set. That's the little geometric figure we were just looking at. And here's a photograph of the grand spiral galaxy. So you can see these close correlations. Here's another beautiful example. This is on the left, you have the brain cells, scale of a few microns. On the right, you have astrophysicists have compiled an image of the universe, and the scale is billions of light years across. So we see this as above, so below, kind of parallel structures. Now, what I've done is taken those fractal ideas and then applied a bit from Einstein's relativity theory, his special relativity came out of these two postulates. One, that the laws of physics are the same in all reference frames, and secondly, the speed of light is universal in all frames of reference. And based on those two, he developed the whole relativity theory. And I want to propose that we need a similar revolution in religion to come to a kind of shall we say, relativity of religion in terms of recognizing the absolute uniqueness of the divine light, that the divine light is universal across all the religions, and that the laws of spirituality, whatever they are, they should be the same in all religions. If they're true in some and not others, then they're not really laws, they're not really universal. And so applying this, and of course in doing so, I'm breaking the orthodox scientific rule of mixing science and religion. A little comic relief there. But basically what I want to propose here is that consciousness itself has a fractal structure. And that if we understand, if we apply this insight from Einstein, that basically whatever spiritual truths there are, they should be true across all the religions. And this fractal structure that we just looked at, if we apply that now to consciousness, then we begin to see new light on insights like from Rumi, who said, the secret turning in your heart is the entire universe turning. And he's not just speaking metaphorically. Rumi is speaking about the fundamental nature of the consciousness in the depths of the human heart. And there's an identity then of the human soul with God. We see the self in every creature and all of creation in the self. Heaven and earth are too small to contain me, says Allah. But I fit easily inside the heart of my beloved devotee. So we see this incredible beauty of the infinity of divinity contained within the depths of the seemingly finite human heart. This is truly remarkable. And this is where this insight from these fractals really shows us. So I'm going to just give you, here's this fractal, and we're just going to take a little journey now. If you can see, we're going to zoom in on this thing, as we did before, but this thing goes for 275 orders of magnitude. And I want you to just reflect on this for a moment. This is purely a mathematical structure. It basically, what we're looking at is a plot of a graph, and we're looking in detail at what is the structure of this mathematical object. Now, fractals came into existence the moment that multiplicity came into existence. So fractals predate humanity. They predate the creation of the earth. As soon as oneness broke into pieces, those pieces are interrelated and they have a fractal structure in relationship to one another. So fractals are inherent in the nature of multiplicity. And what you're seeing here, therefore, is a kind of, if you will, a fingerprint of the mind of God. That this is not a human invention. What you're looking at here is not some wild acid trip that some computer graphic scientist took and then tried to depict his visions, on the screen. This is simply a visual of the structure of this simple mathematical object called fractals. And what I'm suggesting is that there is a parallel in consciousness to what we're seeing here in mathematics. As the great mathematician Ed Frankel said, that mathematics are a hidden reality. And what I'm suggesting is that every time you lift a veil on reality, as the Sufis say, there's yet another veil. So if we lift the veil on physical reality, we see this underlying order that is mathematics. If we lift the veil on that mathematics, we see an underlying divinity which gave rise to that mathematics. And what I'm suggesting here is that this fractal structure shows how it's possible that the infinite can be contained within the finite, because you see all of this incredible complexity, majestic beauty, and yet what does it all lead to? It all leads to what we know is coming is an exact replica on a vastly smaller scale. And there it is. The entire complexity that you just saw on all these orders of magnitude is completely replicated inside this little tiny one. And what I'm suggesting is that this is precisely how it is the case that the full infinity of God, as Meister Eckhart said, is poured into the heart of the beloved disciple. So let me get back to my slideshow here. If my computer will cooperate. So here's the essence of it, that the inmost essence of the human being is one with the infinite transcendent essence of God. The infinite divine is contained within the seemingly finite heart of the human being. And so to draw on this kind of fractal structure parallel, this is how the mathematics of it works. So we have essentially the mathematical infinite, and here we have one formula. That's the one I showed you earlier, and when we plot the graph of that formula, we get this fractal structure here. And so from the infinite, we have one particular principle, which then creates a particular structure that is self-replicating on all these vastly different scales. And what I want to suggest is that divinity works the same way. In analogous manner to the mathematical fractal, divinity also has a fractal structure of consciousness, and so it works the same way. We have the absolute Godhead, then we have a principle of divinity. In Christianity, this would be called the Logos. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So this is essentially the Logos, which then becomes the Trinity in terms of being with God and being God. And this then gives birth to essentially the entire tradition of that particular Logos. So the Logos gives birth to the whole Christian tradition. And in this way, what I'm suggesting, if we take a look at the different religions, in the case of Christianity, we have the infinite, absolute, unconditioned spiritual light and consciousness of God, which then is expressed through the Logos, becoming the Trinity, and then this gives rise to a particular tradition called Christianity. But it's a fractally structured tradition. I'll get to that in a moment. And we see essentially an analogous process happening in the other religions. In the case of Hinduism, we have the Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And in the case of Islam, we have Allah and the 99 names. And I go into a lot more detail in the book about these equivalences. I'm showing these arrows between them because there's a very important principle, which is that each of these contains the others. Let's look now, if I expand it to include Judaism and Buddhism. So in Buddhism, we have the three kayas, the Dharmakaya here, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya, which are essentially the same three levels. And in Judaism, we have here the Ein Sof, and then the tree of life coming down, and then the Malchut, the manifest realm. Now, what I want to point out here is that this is simply a simple ontological sketch, but that at the level of divinity, each one of these is a kind of structure of divine consciousness or light, structured in a particular way. In fact, you could think of it as the plane of divinity as a kind of prism that refracts infinite divine light into each of the different religions, each one essentially like a different particular colored ray of the universal divine light. And on this plane here, they are all in some sense equivalent, and they all contain each other. Let me read you this line from the great Western mystic Plotinus. He's speaking now about this level of spiritual consciousness. He says, there, everything is transparent, nothing dark, nothing resistant. Every being is lucid to every other in breadth and depth. Light runs through light. Light runs through light. And when he said that, that was what gave me actually the impetus to draw this figure in this way. See these different light, the light comes through and it's running through light. And yet each one, they are separate, and yet each one contains all the others. He says, light runs through light. And each fractal contains the full infinity within itself. Here's what Plotinus says. Each of them contains all within itself, and at the same time sees all in every other. So that everywhere there is all is all, and each is all, and infinite is the glory. Each of them is great, the small is great, stars and sun. While some manner of being is dominant in each, all are mirrored in every other. This is the key. Some manner of being is dominant in each. Each one of these is utterly unique and has its own particular sacred treasure and gift to give to the world. And yet all are mirrored in every other, and ultimately each of these contains all the others. It's very similar to the organs of a human body. You think of the lungs, the liver, the brain, the heart. Each one has a very unique function, right? And they all work in a wonderful harmony together. If the heart tried to insist that all the other organs become hearts, what would happen? You'd die. You'd have no brain, you'd have no kidney, you'd have no liver. Even though the heart, we think of it as the most important thing. If everything became a heart, the heart would die. And so we need these different religions just as the body needs these different organs. Yet each one is complete unto itself. Each one is part of a great sacred treasure to humanity from God. So all of this is now theory. How do we put this into practice? And I want to do now just to tell you just couple minutes about how we are seeking to put this into practice. Let's see, actually, let me do one more slide here. Because here's the bottom line. As Thomas Keating, one of our mentors, said so beautifully, the entire purpose of Christianity is transformation into Christ, nothing else. That's what it's all about. And we could say the same for Buddhism. The entire purpose of Buddhism is transformation into Buddha. The entire purpose of Vaishnavite Hinduism is transformation into Krishna. We are to become these deities here on earth. That can sound grandiose, but actually it's an act of extreme humility. It is the call of the heart to each of us. And so it's not enough, as Thomas Keating says, to simply respect and listen patiently to others' religious beliefs. What we need to do is to learn to love other religions and to share our spiritual experience. This is the call of of the new kind of pathway of inter-spirituality. You know, interfaith, we've had interfaith, and interfaith is has a very important place, but it tends to focus on a kind of comparative theology and then showcases the different liturgies. You know, you come to my synagogue and I'll come to your mass. That's good. That has a place. But there's a much deeper meeting that's now beginning to happen. And the interspiritual impulse in which mystics and spiritual leaders are coming together and they're sharing spiritual practices, plumbing the depths of the spiritual riches across the spiritual journeys, and coming into a place of becoming friends and collaborators on the spiritual journey. And to support that process and to put flesh and blood on all of this, I'm going to share with you, if I can get my little cursor here. Where did it go? Here it is. Cynthia and I and our institute has been organizing conferences since 2009, every 2 or 3 years. We organize a conference. That's not it. I just lost somehow. Maybe it's not going to let me do this. I'm not sure. Displays. Sorry. Here we are with technology. Let me see if I can get this to mirror. There we go. Did that do it? Yeah. Okay. So we are doing a series of conferences, and this is the next one, which is going to be in Costa Rica. You're all invited. We have plenty of space. This is my shameless marketing pitch to close, but it's really important, even if you can't make it. I have to tell you what exquisite work this is, because we are bringing together these spiritual leaders from all these different traditions. So this one here is Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo, the Buddhist nun who lived in a cave for 12 years meditating 12 hours a day, and then came out and founded a nunnery to give to women practices that have been denied to women for over 1,400 years in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And then Sister Lucy Kurian, who Janet mentioned, and some of you have met. This is the Catholic nun from India. And she is the one who has created these 44 homes across India. That's my timer to remind me to finish, so I'm closing up here. And then we have also remarkable healers that are bringing the religions together in a very active way. This man, Father Marco, and this Muslim Omar Aboud, and then this rabbi at the bottom, Daniel Goldman. These three, they work closely. Those three work closely with Pope Francis. They founded Institute for Interspiritual Dialogue in Argentina. And so those three have formed this institute to spread love across the Abrahamic faith throughout South America. And then their counterparts, Jamal Rahman. Some of you may know Jamal Rahman from the Interfaith Community Sanctuary. He's right here. And then Ted Falcon, the rabbi, and he, who are also doing the same thing in North America. None of them have ever met. They're going to meet for the first time at this conference. And then this man, who's the General Secretary of the Danish Council of Churches, Mads Christoffersen, and Radwa Salah from Lebanon. You remember that Danish cartoon where they made fun of the prophet? And the Muslim world was outraged and started burning Danish flags all around. In response to that, he and she created a whole series of multi-year dialogues between Danish religious leadership and Middle Eastern Muslim leaders for several years. And so they're going to be there reporting on that work. So I just want to say that for us, it is all about taking this beautiful vision of the oneness of the world religions and then putting it into practice and bringing the great mystics and contemplatives of the different traditions together so that we can literally build a new civilization of love on the earth. This is our birthright, it is our destiny, and we invite all of you to come down to Costa Rica and get some warm sunshine and help us do this together. Thank you.